Good evening, everyone. My name is Adrianette Ciccone, and I am happy to welcome you to this wonderful program. Shay?
And my name is Shay Aaron Gilmore, and I am the chair of the Cannabis Practitioners Group of the California Lawyers Association. We are a CLA-wide organization focused on providing legal education on cannabis law issues to California lawyers. And if you are a licensed California lawyer, I encourage you to get in touch with me so that you can learn more about getting involved with the Cannabis Practitioners Group, who is proudly co-presenting tonight's program along with the Racial Justice Committee, chaired by Adrianette Chacon.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Shay. This program was really born out of me listening to Shay speak at the annual meeting and being really impressed by the work that the Cannabis Committee is doing. So, the Racial Justice Committee was founded in 2020 in response to the murder of George Floyd. It was founded in the litigation section, and then it moved on to be a CLA wide committee, just like the Cannabis Committee is. And we are always looking for wonderful volunteers to help us with programming, advocacy, or resources. We do have a website, so please visit the website. I also want to note that I am speaking this evening in my own individual capacity and not on behalf of any agency or organization other than the CLA Racial Justice Committee. When we founded this in 2020, what we really wanted to do was provide education to our members and to our non-members, just education to the community about racial disparities, history, and marginalized group, just to bring attention. Terrence Evans actually helped co-found the Racial Justice Committee with me, and he co-chairs the committee with me. So Terrence is here. Terrence is also a rock star. He is the chair of the California Lawyers Association, in addition to the many other hats Terrence wears. Terrence?
Well, thank you so much, Adrianette. You're very kind. It's an honor to be here with such talent and discussing a very important issue, not only to CLA, but the broader legal community and our society in general, discussing the disparities in how people, particularly communities of color, have been treated disproportionately with respect to cannabis and other related substances. And we just have the most talented group that you could ever dream of to be part of this very important discussion. Adrianette, as she mentioned, is the co-founder of our Racial Justice Committee. Shay Gilmore, a longtime friend of mine, has been a leader in this space. And all of the other speakers that you will hear from will help enlighten our understanding of these very important issues. So I'm hopeful that you will sit back, relax, learn, and enjoy this very important information that's being shared. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the virtual microphone to the moderator of this incredible program, the amazing Khalil Ferguson.
Thank you for that, Terrence. My name is Khalil Ferguson. I am a recent graduate of McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento, California. I will be your moderator for the evening. And before we dive into this important discussion, I would like to introduce our panelists and presenters for the evening. I will start in no particular order with Beau Kilmer. Beau Kilmer is a coordinator of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center, a senior policy researcher at RAND, and a professor of policy analysis at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. Next, we have Dr. William Garriott. Dr. William Garriott is a professor and chair of the Law, Politics, and Society program at Drake University. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Magaly Ordonez. Dr. Magaly Ordonez is a Latinx Sexualities postdoctoral fellow at the University of Utah, identifying with they/them pronouns. Dr. Ordonez completed their PhD in Feminist Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And without further ado, I will pass it to our first presenter for the night, Beau Kilmer. I think you're on mute, doctor.
Well, that's a problem. Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that everyone can see my slides.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about some of the research that I've been doing on cannabis legalization and social equity. As Khalil mentioned, I work at the RAND Drug Policy Research Center. For those of you who don't know much about RAND, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that really tries to improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis. We work on a ton of different areas, but at the nexus of the work that we do on health and social and economic well-being and in criminal justice or the criminal legal system, we have our Drug Policy Research Center, where we work on all aspects of substance use and drug policy. And I've spent a lot of time over the past 15, 20 years working on cannabis policy, especially adult use legalization. Just want to make it clear, Rand, we don't have an official position on this. We're really just trying to do the research to kind of help inform these conversations at the local, state, and federal level. I want to do two things over the next 20 minutes or so. One, spend some time talking about the economics of cannabis, because I think that's really important for grounding a lot of the conversations we're going to be having about social equity and cannabis policy. I then want to highlight 6 kind of puzzles or trade-offs that I think will be that are really important when you're stepping back and thinking about how you design or how you potentially update a social equity policy at the state or local level. A lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today are based on a number of collaborations. So for anyone who's interested in any of these documents, just go to rand.org and they're available there. But it's been fascinating. So as I said, I've been in this field for a while. And, early on when Washington and Colorado passed legalization in 2012, racial equity wasn't a big part of the conversation. I mean, of course, people were talking about reducing disparities in arrests and incarceration. But there wasn't as much focus on kind of where I would say now social equity really is a front burner issue when we're talking about cannabis policy. But, over time, after Colorado and Washington legalized, we then began to see states kind of taking it to the next level, saying, okay, we're not just going to try to reduce the disparities in arrests, but also potentially sealing or expunging records. But even then, early on, when states would do this, they would largely put the onus on the individual to have to petition the court, maybe hire a lawyer. And then over time, states began to realize that, hey, wait, the onus shouldn't be on these individuals. The onus should be on the state. And so you then began to see a shift to where it was the state's responsibility to expunge or seal these records. You then, obviously, there's been a lot more focus on entrepreneurship and employment in the cannabis industry. And then there's also been some really interesting things happening with how governments are spending their cannabis tax revenues. For example, Evanston, Illinois, as many people know, they use some of their cannabis tax revenues for slavery reparations. So I'm thrilled. The conversations really have evolved, over the past 10, 15 years. But, it's really interesting when you think about, well, who should benefit from these equity initiatives? Is it those that were arrested or convicted for possession? Well, what about those that were maybe convicted for sales? Should it be those who live in communities that were disproportionately affected by cannabis prohibition? And if so, how is that going to be defined? Should it maybe benefit those that who are dealing with social inequities that had nothing to do with cannabis laws? So this is just one of the many questions that I think we all need to grapple with when thinking about how to design or redesign some of these efforts at the state levels. But as I said, I want to spend a good chunk of time talking about the economics of cannabis legalization, because it's really important for a lot of the outcomes that we care about, especially social equity. And when we look at the price of cannabis after legalization, obviously that has implications for what happens to the size of the illegal market, what can happen to consumption, what happens to tax revenues, which then could potentially be reinvested into equity initiatives, but it also has really important implications for the profitability of licensed businesses. And obviously, the profitability is going to influence what happens to employment, wealth generation, as well as social equity. So when you look at a lot of the outcomes that get discussed in legalization debates, a lot of it comes down to what's going to happen to the prices. But we know that there's multiple reasons why legalization of cannabis is going to push down your production and distribution costs. Most importantly, you're getting rid of the risks, right? When someone would be purchasing, cannabis back in the day, or, methamphetamine or heroin, a lot of what you're doing is compensating the drug dealer and everyone else along the supply chain for the risk of arrest and risk of incarceration. Realize with legalization, that goes away. Also, there's what Peter Reuter calls the structural consequences of product illegality, which is just a fancy way of saying that when you're operating in the illegal market, it's just less efficient. Get harder to get access to capital, to buy machinery, you've got smaller grows. So once again, you would think that with legalization, that would really kind of make things a bit more efficient. And then also, if you allow large organizations to grow in this space, I mean, they could take advantage of economies of scale. And I have to say, when we first started looking at this around 2010, no one was really talked much about what was happening with prices. And I remember back then, I mean, we were predicting that in California, you would see wholesale prices potentially decline 80%, even more. And I remember a bunch of people saying, well, what do all those RAND nerds know about growing weed? They just didn't think that we would see drops that large. But sure enough, that's what we're seeing. And, obviously it takes longer in some places for the prices to decline. But yeah, the production and the wholesale costs have gone down quite a bit in a number of states that have legalized. But that said, even if your production and your distribution costs go down, that doesn't mean that the retail prices have to fall. There are lots of different things you could do with respect to setting prices or potentially having state stores. There are a lot of models where you could still kind of keep the prices inflated if you wanted to, but that's not how it's played out in the US. And so this is just one example, tracking the data from Oregon. You can see that, and this is for the median price for a gram of flower. You can see in 2017, it was above $10. By 2024, that it dropped to less than $4, so about a 60% decrease. But one thing to kind of keep in mind is, not only have the prices been going down, but potency levels have been going up. And so this particular chart doesn't adjust for potency, but we've been doing some work analyzing data from the state of California. So we have information on every single cannabis product that was sold in the legal market. So I think it's close to 800 million transactions right now. And so we've actually not just been looking at what's been happening with prices, but also the price per unit of THC, the main intoxicant in cannabis. And we can see that there have been large declines just since 2020, just for the price of price per unit of THC. And I was doing some work the other day. I'm from Michigan, and I was trying to find some information on the price for a gram of flower in Michigan. I mean, Michigan has a lot of production, a lot of stores, they have pretty cheap prices. And I didn't cherry pick this, but the first website I went to, they actually were running a sale where you could get 2 ounces of cannabis out the door with taxes included for less than $50. Realize, I mean, that's what, 56, 57 grams of cannabis. We know that, some of your more frequent users maybe use close to 1.9 or 2 grams a day. But essentially what this suggests is that for heavy use, for people that use every single day, they might be able to, when we're talking about flower here, they might be able to get a month's supply for less than $50. That's a huge decline. And I know typically in Michigan right now, an ounce is going for about $80. But this just another example of, especially when you give out a lot of licenses and there's a lot of competition, you're going to see those prices go down. And I would expect that they would continue to go down in these states. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is all happening with cannabis prohibited at the federal level. And you talk to a lot of people that are in the industry, and obviously the federal prohibition creates headaches for a lot of these companies. And we could talk about 280E and some of the other issues. But one thing a lot of people won't tell you is that it's the federal prohibition that keeps a lot of these entrepreneurs actually in business. And in fact, we estimated for that Boston University Law Journal article that I showed earlier, that you can produce all the THC that's consumed in the United States on a few dozen industrial-sized farms. That's it. So you can imagine that if cannabis was legalized at the federal level, and you could, and you can move it across state lines, you can see the industry concentrate very quickly. You don't need a lot of space to produce all the THC. And then that's just within the United States. But depending on what legalization looks like, it may actually be cheaper to grow it in another country than extract out the THC, the CBD, and some of the other cannabinoids, and then just import it. So there are a number of reasons why federal legalization could push these prices down even more, especially at the production distribution level. But then also, what if Amazon is eventually allowed to distribute? This would make it much harder for a lot of your smaller entrepreneurs to compete in this industry. And this is something to keep in mind, especially when we begin thinking about, well, what are some of the trade-offs and puzzles that you confront when you're thinking about, designing or redesigning some of these equity programs? And the first one is, and this is pretty obvious, that, if the target group or area that you're focused on is too large, then the resources are going to get spread thin, and then there's a risk of helping people who don't really need it. And so this is, I remember, I don't know if it was Seattle or there was one place where they made that when they were making decisions about who was eligible for equity, to get an equity license. I think it was based on zip code, or it might have been Seattle or another place. But when you do it by zip code, and especially if it's a place that's gentrifying, you're going to end up helping a lot of white folks that weren't the target for this particular program. So you have to be thoughtful about the size of the group that you really want to benefit with these with the changes in cannabis policies. Another trade-off to consider is that if you define beneficiaries by their race or ethnicity, it can lead to legal challenges. In fact, I remember doing some work talking to some states in the Midwest, and they had a big equity program, providing giving priority to equity licensees was just one part of what they were doing, but obviously they were trying to focus, on dealing with racial disparities. But they were so worried about incorporating race or ethnicity because they were worried there would be legal challenges that it could shut down that part of their equity market or their equity program. They were actually concerned that it could then lead to a shutdown of their entire equity market or equity program. So this is something you have to be thoughtful of. And, in some other states, a number of places will do this. They'll look at arrest disparities and kind of, and then kind of, in using that, then will determine which geographic locations should get a priority for equity licenses. Another trade-off is that, or another thing to consider here is that if you stepping up enforcement against the illegal market could actually help a lot of these equity licensees. But we have to be careful here. When people hear increased enforcement, they automatically think that it's going to increase the criminal legal pressure. But it could also be the case that increased enforcement could just mean that you step up, fines or do things more on the civil side. And in fact, we saw, the great example of this is in New York. New York was thoughtful about designing their equity program to where they were initially only going to allow retailers who were equity licensees or nonprofit organizations. And then they also weren't initially going to allow any of the legacy medical businesses to be a part of it. So that was the plan, and it made a lot of sense. However, after they legalized, you then had a number of bodegas selling cannabis illegally, untaxed, and then that just exploded. There were some estimates that in New York City, there might have been 1,000 or even 1,500 places that were selling cannabis illegally. And what that meant was, then when your equity licensees and then your nonprofit organizations were opening up their stores, they were then competing with all these people that were selling untaxed cannabis, making things much harder for these equity licensees and the nonprofit organizations. So you have to be thoughtful about this, especially when, there typically tends to be about a 2-year lag after legalization gets passed and then when the stores open. And it's shorter or longer depending on the state. But states tend to focus a lot on spending those 2 years figuring out what's the licensing regime going to be, who's going to get the licenses, reviewing applications, so forth. I think it's really important to spend a good chunk of that time as well thinking about how you're going to step up enforcement so you can begin moving people over to the to the legal market, because when the illegal market's still there, it can make it a lot harder for some of your smaller businesses to compete. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that legalization could end up reducing total employment in the cannabis industry. We spent a lot of time talking about jobs, and obviously there's a difference between working in the illegal market and the legal market. But just one thing to kind of keep in mind when you're seeing these numbers that, oh, legalization has increased employment by X thousand numbers of jobs, realize there also were a lot of people that were working in the illegal industry that potentially lost their jobs. So when you're kind of doing those, just realize when you see those numbers, it's a bit more complicated than that. And in fact, as I said, as bigger businesses come in and they're more efficient, and especially if there's delivery, it could actually end up reducing the total number of people who work in the cannabis industry. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if with some of these programs, if you're increasing the number of licensees in a particular place, say in terms of retail, that could not only kind of further decrease the prices and the profits for those businesses, but it could also increase promotion and the availability of cannabis in that particular community. And obviously, this is something we saw with liquor stores, and we're seeing the same thing happening with cannabis dispensaries. They're locating in a lot of the same in a lot of those same places. And so this is something to kind of keep in mind. And obviously, you could design it in a way to where you could potentially, in a geographic area, you could potentially, limit the number of retail outlets. But for equity, licensees, once there are enough retailers in a particular place, then they could potentially open up somewhere else. But this is just something you have to consider. And the final point I want to make here is that federal legalization obviously would reduce some adult cannabis arrests. I mean, most of the arrests with respect to cannabis happen at the state and local level, but there are people that, some people do getting arrested at the federal level. Like legalization is going to kind of reduce that particular burden, but it's going to end up, it could likely put, a lot of smaller businesses and equity licenses out of business. It could just make it harder to compete. So to conclude, as I said, I'm thrilled that equity now is kind of this front burner issue. Stepping back and reducing inequities is not really that controversial in the space, but there are a lot of, as I just kind of gave you 6 of them, but there are a lot of trade-offs and a lot of things you need to think through in order to kind of make these programs work. And the one thing that I haven't seen happen yet is, when a state's thinking about doing, implementing a social equity program, I think it'd be really important to kind of step back and say, okay, let's think about the number, what's the size of our market? How many stores are we going to allow? How much money are these stores going to make? How much money could that potentially put back into certain communities? And then actually kind of run the numbers and then look at the number of your policy choices and figure out, okay, which of these policy choices make the most sense if your goal, for example, is to build wealth in certain communities. I have yet to see a jurisdiction that's kind of step back and just do this simple policy analysis here. Because I do think that we need to be thoughtful about this, because it can be hard to compete in these markets. And it might be the case that, look, if someone's looking to invest in the cannabis industry, it might make more sense for them to invest that money in another industry. I mean, obviously, that's going to depend on the industry we're talking about in the place, but this is something I think that should be part of the conversation. And then obviously, even when a state goes ahead with some of these programs, I think you need to anticipate the need for mid-course corrections, especially if there is a change at the federal level. So with that, I will close and look forward to the other presentations and any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Beau. I think very informative. I am very aware of all the issues you presented, and you are very accurate and spot on. I had a few questions for you in alignment with what your presentation that I just think you could spend a couple minutes expanding on. And this will probably be a compound question, but do any barriers remain to having records fully expunged? And is there any relief, or do you expect any relief to come at the federal level for the expungement of criminal records if cannabis is legalized?
Well, look, I'm not a lawyer, and I understand that there are very much differences between expunging and sealing, kind of depending on the state. It's my understanding that not all states allow for expungement or sealing of criminal records. As I said, I haven't kind of reviewed all of the laws on that. But at the federal level, I'm not sure what's happening now. I mean, obviously there were conversations about this in the previous administration. I'm not sure what's happening with, it's really hard to tell what's happening with cannabis policy now, whether it be with respect to, pardons or, what's happening with rescheduling. There were conversations about about cannabis going from Schedule 1 potentially to Schedule 3. It's unclear to me what's happening with that. But I do think the thing to kind of keep in mind is even when we talk about pardons or anything, any type of action that happens at the federal level, that for the most part, I mean, that's pretty small. I mean, obviously there are people, some dealers that are, incarcerated for longer periods, and obviously, them getting out of prison that could improve their lives as well as the lives of their loved ones. But most of the action in this space is at the state and local level. I want to say more than 90% of all arrests for cannabis, at least kind of pre-legalization, was not at the federal level.
Thank you for that. And one more question, and then we will move on to the next presentation. But this one could call for a lengthy conversation between us, or maybe even a very little bit longer discourse. But is there anything about the emerging intoxicating hemp market that has implications for cannabis and cannabis social equity discussions?
Yeah. So for those, I don't know how much folks in the audience have been following what's been happening, but long story short, with the federal farm bill that was passed in 2018, it essentially said that cannabis sativa, so hemp products that have less than 0.3% THC, would no longer be called marijuana. That's what it's called under federal law. In the Controlled Substances Act, it would be called industrial hemp, and it wouldn't be subject to the Controlled Substances Act. Well, what that did is it created this loophole to where you had industrial hemp being grown all over the place, and a lot of it was CBD heavy. Well, from that CBD, you can then synthesize out Delta 8 THC, which some people refer to as weed light, and it's a cannabinoid. It's going to get you intoxicated. You can also synthesize Delta 9 out of that, Delta 10. There's these other products. So now you've seen this proliferation of products being sold, especially in states that haven't legalized. For example, I just started doing some research in Indiana. And so Indiana has no medical, no adult use. There was one estimate for 2023 that there were nearly 2,000 places selling these intoxicating hemp products in Indiana, about 1,400 of them being gas stations. Texas, I've seen numbers, close to 5,000-6,000 stores. Anyways, so this is, and states have different approaches. Some states have banned these kind of intoxicating hemp products. Others are regulating them. Others are just allowing them to be sold in gas stations. But I do think this is important. Especially for places that haven't legalized or places that are in the process of designing their equity programs. As I said, you got to be thinking about competition. And earlier I was talking about competition potentially from Amazon or competition, from producers in other countries. But if you have people that are selling these intoxicating hemp products, this is something we also need to consider. And especially because the other thing, when we talk about intoxicating hemp, yes, we're talking about Delta 8, Delta 10, and a lot of these other cannabinoids, but also the way it's being interpreted, it's any cannabis product that has less than 0.3% THC. So if you think about one of those kind of Haribo gummy bears, let's say it's about 3 grams, which would be 3,000 milligrams. You multiply that by that 0.3%. That means that little Haribo gummy bear, if it had THC in it, can have up to 9 milligrams of THC. And realize people are having conversations about a standard dose of THC would be 5 milligrams. So there's direct competition there. So it's not just Delta 8 and these other intoxicating hemp products. It's also Delta 9 in the gummies and the drinks. So I think that it's just another wrinkle. And so I think, Khalil, to get back to I think it was my second to last point, for jurisdictions that are designing these equity programs or redesigning them, I think it's important to just step back, begin running the numbers, thinking about what's going to happen with prices, what's going to happen with the size of the market, but then you also have to incorporate, potential competition from those that are selling these industrial hemp products.
Thank you for that. That's a very good point. If we have any lobbyists or government officials, regulators here, I think that these are very good points to consider when evaluating some of our state and our state cannabis equity programs or funds that go to local equity programs as a condition to understand the current market and landscape. for if these programs truly are serving the intended audiences and what the outcomes of these programs truly are. The critique generally is that they are not, but that's really just anecdotal evidence or anecdotal perspectives, but it needs to be truly evaluated if these programs are actually having the impact that we say they are intending to. So thank you for your presentation, Beau.
Hey, thanks, Khalil.
So we will move on to our next presentation. Our next presentation will be, or the next presenter will be Dr. William Garriott. Again, Dr. William Garriott is a professor and chair of the Law, Politics, and Society program at Drake University.
Okay, can I get confirmation that people can see my slides and hear me?
I can hear you and see your slides.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you very much for letting me be a part of this. So again, I'm Will Garriott. I'm in the Law, Politics, and Society department at Drake University. And before I say anything else, I want to have a quick note on language. As I think most folks here know, there continues to be debate about what language we should use. Cannabis, I think, is quickly establishing itself as the preferred term, but in law and a lot of other places, marijuana, weed, other terms get used. I will probably be using these terms interchangeably, in part because that is the area that I work in, is a space where these words are used interchangeably. So a little bit about me. So I'm a legal anthropologist by training. My interest is in crime and criminal justice in the US. As an anthropologist, I take an ethnographic approach. And what that means basically is that I'm interested in looking at questions like this, questions of drugs, of drug policy, of policing, through the lens of lived experience. My early work was actually on methamphetamine. In the mid-2000s, I looked at the emergence of in response to the methamphetamine problem in the rural United States. Since 2014, I have been looking at issues related to the legalization of cannabis. And I have focused specifically on the state of Colorado, along with Washington. It was one of the first two states to legalize recreationally in 2012. Since really 2014, I have been engaged in Colorado doing ethnographic and other kinds of research, trying to understand what's happening in the area of legalization from the people who are living it. And so I know this session is framed from the perspective of how it started and how it's going. And I've really latched onto that language as a way to frame what I share with you today. And I mentioned that I like to think about these issues through the perspective of lived experience. So I want to start with the story of a person who has been impacted both by prohibition and legalization and social equity. So this is Terrence Hewing. He was arrested in Colorado in 2007. Basically, the situation was that he was working at the time as a delivery driver. He got to a delivery early, decided to take a quick nap in his van. Someone saw him, called the police. They showed up. They searched his vehicle. They found a pound of cannabis. They arrested him. He spent a few days in jail, ended up with a felony conviction, ended up having to pay thousands of dollars in fines and fees. He lost his job, continued to struggle with issues of housing, issues related to work, and there were issues of just general social stigma that he experienced. So he says here, I felt like I was in a certain box in society. There's people that don't have felonies and people that do. It makes you feel kind of outcast. And so if we think about the history of the legalization movement, one of the goals has been to stop things like this from happening. But what about people to whom it has already happened? That is really the question that social equity takes up and the experience of someone like Terrence raises. So in the early days, particularly in those early legalization states like Colorado, they really just said, no, legalization has nothing to offer folks who have already been impacted. But over time, that answer was no longer sufficient for a lot of folks, and so social equity movement was born. So I have a lot of kind of information and data on the slides. I'm not going to read it all to you, but I do just want to highlight a few things to situate us around this question of why social equity, why now? Social equity emerges at a very particular moment in the evolution of the legalization movement. It emerges in, I would say, kind of the latest 2010s, at this moment when legalization as a movement has really had a number of wins. Several states have come online legalizing recreational or adult use, but also there's starting to be some frustration. And so in this moment, there's an acknowledgement that legalization alone has not been enough to rectify the harms of prohibition and the war on drugs, a particular focus on the fact that racial disparities persist even after legalization, and those most likely to have been harmed by prohibition emerging as the least likely to be benefiting from legalization, particularly economically. So quick overview of kind of what we know about marijuana enforcement as it relates to questions of social equity. So looking at the 90s, we see that marijuana or cannabis arrests were nearly half of the 1.5 million drug arrests annually, and that there were significant racial disparities in those arrests. We move to the next decade, so the early 2000s. This is a time when the medical marijuana movement is starting to gain traction. Nevertheless, we still see millions of marijuana arrests taking place. And in fact, marijuana arrests become over half of all drug arrests in the US at this time. And again, significant racial disparities in what those arrests look like. Moving into the beginnings of the adult use recreational legalization era, we see that these arrests start trending down, yet we see more arrests in 2018 than 2015, despite 8 states having legalized. Arrests again are down, but still 43% of all drug arrests in 2018. And once again, racial disparities continue to persist. On top of that, so some of these dynamics were familiar from the Prohibition days. On top of that, we see inequities within the legal cannabis industry. So if you take a look at Colorado in 2021, you see that 85% of owner licensees were white, less than 2.5% were African American, around 7% Hispanic. And you compare that to representation in the general population, 4.6% of the state is African American and nearly 22% is Hispanic. And so this was the context in which social equity, the push for social equity emerged. This is Wanda James, who's a significant figure in the legalization movement nationally, but particularly in Colorado. She said in 2020, social equity is about righting the wrongs of the drug war and giving diversity a strong foothold in the developing industry. We all know the drug war unfairly targeted people and communities of color, leaving families and people stuck in the criminal justice system for decades. We legalized a plant and too many people of color were unable to participate in this new market opportunity. And so all of this is taking place while there are broader changes happening in the push for civil rights, in the push for racial justice. And so one of the points of convergence we see here is an evolution in the fight for civil rights as it evolves from the rights gap to targeting the wealth gap. And here again, we hear Wanda James say, I've often said that my father's generation fought to be able to ride the bus, to get on the bus and sit where they wanted to on the bus. Our challenge is, how do we own the bus? How do we own the bus line? So it's one thing to decriminalize, which is great. We should not be going to jail for this, but now let's take it a step further. Terrence Ewing said something very similar. We're trying to get it where we're actually creating businesses and owners and generational wealth. People can help their communities and restore the negative damage that was caused by the war on drugs. So several points of convergence here. So this is building on some of the things that Beau already talked about, but I talk about what's happening in the social equity space as the social equity paradigm. And each state is a little bit different, but they each tend to target 3 particular issues. One is industry access, the second is criminal records, and the third is tax revenue distribution. So here we move into the and how it's going part of it. So I'm going to look at each of these three pillars in turn. So industry access focuses on programs for qualifying social equity applicants. Each state defines social equity applicant a little bit differently, but if you qualify, you tend to have access to things like prioritization in the application process, special funding, fee reduction, training, and in some cases, maybe access to license types that are restricted just for social equity applicants. Here's just a couple of images. So this is Social Cannabis, the first social equity dispensary in Colorado. And this is Dan Morgan, the first social equity owner who qualified because of a cannabis conviction that he got his senior year of college when he was in Wyoming. This is the company that Terrence Hewing started with his wife, Sarah Woodson, who is also an entrepreneur in the cannabis space and is also a really significant advocate within Colorado and was instrumental in getting the social equity program started in the state. They started, instead of going the dispensary route, they started a delivery service called High Demand Delivery. And then this is a picture of their team in 2022. So criminal records, seal, expunge, pardon, there's different ways to go about it. They tend to focus on low-level offenses and more specifically, things that are legal now after legalization. Colorado did not have a social equity program until 2020. That's when the legislature passed one. And one of the things that did is it gave the governor the power to pardon people who were convicted of things that were now legal. And so in October of 2020, he pardoned about 2,700 people convicted of possession of 1 ounce or less. There was an additional wave of pardons when the state limit went up. And so people convicted of 2 ounces or less. Tax revenue distribution. The idea here is that money generated by legal cannabis sales part of that will be taken and invested or reinvested in disproportionately impacted communities. How that's defined varies from state to state, but the basic idea here is that folks who've been impacted by kind of negative economic experience or negative interaction with the justice system. And funding goes to state agencies, but also nonprofits offering programming and social supports in areas of health, education, et cetera. So a quick overview of this. So there's been a little over $2 billion raised in Colorado from legal cannabis sales. You don't have to look at the nitty gritty of these charts that I'm going to share, but I do want to just show how revenue has fluctuated over time and has actually been going down recently. This is just to show you that there is a formula that shows how that determines how money is taken in and divided. This shows you a little bit about how much is going into each pot. And then this just gives you a sense of how that money is divided, the kinds of things it's going towards. And these are the top organizations within the state that are getting money. And you'll see that it's things like human services, several different things related to schools and education, public health. There is some public safety money, but in general, this is money that is going to a different kind of infrastructure of support. Definitely do not need to try to read all of this. Again, this is just giving you a sense of the kinds of programs that grants are funding. So there is some enforcement, but it's behavioral health, it's medical, it is school-based programs, treatment, those kinds of things. Youth programming, research. And so now I want to move into talking about challenges. So that was just kind of an overview of here's how the program is structured, here's what it's designed to do. And so there's two main areas of challenge. The first one I'm just going to mention briefly, but it is important to mention, and these are formal legal challenges primarily brought through litigation. And these are situations where people have challenged the constitutionality of key provisions of social equity programs. And it's beyond the scope of my time today to get into this, but dormant commerce clause, due process, and equal protection, these are key constitutional issues where courts are being asked to weigh in. And in general, courts have been, I will just say, disinclined to see social equity programs as constitutional because of the way that they restrict market access and because of the way that they restrict in certain cases based on race. So it's definitely something that states and other stakeholders need to be mindful of. And then just there are significant administrative challenges. You get into things like the actual process of expungement or the process by which you administer a licensing lottery, significant legal administrative challenges there. But I want to focus more on these implementation challenges because these are things that I think are much more immediate and proximus for people who are working in the social equity space. So industry challenges, the biggest thing is you've got conflicting laws and policies. So you may have a social equity program designed to enhance access, but it is coexisting with other policies designed to limit it, things like license caps, the ability for local jurisdictions to opt out, zoning laws, really basic things like commercial versus residential, but also specific things like no dispensaries within 1,000 feet of a school. In Colorado, you also have situations where disproportionately impacted neighborhoods that have been disproportionately impacted by the cannabis industry itself. Local residents feel like there's too much of a concentration of grow facilities or dispensaries, and they are trying to limit. And that's coming into conflict with the fact that if those communities are also low income, residents may qualify as social equity applicants. Significant administrative burdens and costs. So again, an example here is that even though you may get state funding, it is not sufficient to actually get you started in the business. And so, for instance, in Colorado, initially providing about $250,000, up to $250,000 in funding. I mean, that's a lot of money, but Wanda James thought that that might get you your initial inventory, but you really would need millions if you wanted to really get started as a dispensary owner. And if you are qualifying for social equity status because you are low income or something like that, it creates this kind of catch-22. Taxes and price. Since I knew I'd be talking to folks in California, I felt like I wanted to make a reference to the letter that was sent in 2021 by cannabis business leaders to the governor, comparing their situation to that faced by people involved in the Boston Tea Party, really focused on taxation, on pricing, on burdensome regulation, things that they felt like were undermining their ability to be successful. So just briefly, this quote here states, without meaningful change, many, if not most, licensed cannabis companies will face a desperate choice: pay exorbitant taxes into a system designed for failure, or pay employees so they can feed their families. None of us want to make that choice. So again, tax is very appealing to a lot of stakeholders, but a challenge to people in the industry. We have competing priority groups. Again, social equity, who counts as a social equity applicant varies from state to state, and these things can actually work at cross purposes. And in fact, Sarah Woodson, who I mentioned before, commented recently when she was asked to reflect on the 5 years of social equity in Colorado. She said the people that have profited the most off social equity have not been Black and brown people. They've been white owners with previous convictions and money. So again, definitions in law not necessarily doing the work that people expected or hoped it would. Criminal record challenges quickly. Each state does them differently, and they can be surprisingly difficult to administer. They can be challenged by district attorneys. They can be time consuming for people. They can cost money. And then another element is just that they are limited in application. So Terrence, who I mentioned at the beginning, is actually not eligible to have his for a pardon because his offense would still be illegal today. And that points to a broader issue, which is just that a lot of what someone might want to do with the cannabis plant is still illegal even after legalization. And this is this is a challenge for some of the, I think, the broader goals of social equity. Tax revenue, again, I'll go through this quickly. There are challenges here. If anyone's ever worked in a sector where you're relying on grants, you know that you're just constantly trying to keep that funding going. That's can be burdensome. It also makes funding for programs and services contingent on how the legal cannabis market is doing. And then maybe the most important one from my perspective is that on balance, it's not a lot of money. So yes, I mean, $282 million is a lot of money, but relative to the state budget and relative to need, it's not a lot. So it's less than 1% of the state budget. And if you want to look at like what came in 22, 23 in Colorado, $282 million, but you compare that to what Denver alone spends on policing alone, they only spend slightly less than that just on policing. So if we think about the scope and the need, the amount of money that's coming in from cannabis isn't quite where it probably needs to be in order to do the kind of transformational work that I think a lot of folks hope. So to conclude, looking ahead, I think being aware that there are just competing priorities when we think about cannabis policy, and the goals of social equity don't always align well with the goals of the regulated commercial marketplace or industry. And because the marketplace has really become the epicenter of how legalization works and happens in the United States, that's a really significant tension to think through. And I've said that, I think about this as the social equity paradigm. So one of the things I would just lift up as something for folks to think through is just, given these challenges, is it time for a paradigm shift if the goals are social equity and doing more in the social equity space? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will. Very informative. I didn't have the time, but briefly read through your law review article on this, and I definitely will take the time to get into the details. But thank you for bringing to light a lot of these legal issues that social equity advocates have been facing in real time over the past decade, and advocating for the legalization of cannabis and then the inclusion of war on drug impacted communities into cannabis policy and benefits and resources as a result of cannabis legalization. So thank you for that. In your presentation, you focused a lot on how there's tension between the policy goals of social equity advocates and social equity policy, with the commercial marketization of cannabis, as well as some of the underlying constitutional rights, the due process clause, certain 14th Amendment issues with regards to dormant commerce clause issues and due process issues under the Fourth Amendment. How can legalization or inclusion in the license industry be framed that doesn't include the market approach?
Say the question part again. It just broke up on my end a little bit.
Sorry, yes. How can legalization or inclusion in the licensed cannabis industry be framed that does not include the market or rely on the market approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really, I think, the big question that's worth thinking about. I mean, I think imagining non-market-based approaches to legalization is a place to start. They exist. There's ways that you can legalize that don't involve creating a commercial market. There are co-op models. There are kind of state monopoly models. But even those, in most places these days, are still going to exist in a capitalist context, because that is the economic system in which most of us live. And so even if we think about the legacy market or the unauthorized market, I mean, that itself is a market that more or less plays by the rules of capitalism. So I think some form grappling with the market in some way feels inevitable to me. Where I think there is opportunity is to really dig into how that market is structured. Because, and I had people tell me this very early on, when I was doing my research, is they would say, well, this is not a free market. Like, I'm a free market guy, but this is not a free market because we need restrictions to protect public health, to protect public safety. It looks like gaming, it looks like alcohol, these kinds of things. And so it already is a market that is structured in particular ways. And so I think there are ways that you could dig into the regulations and imagine different types of marketization that create more opportunities for social equity. And this isn't my primary area of expertise, but I will say some of the things that folks have talked about are really trying to craft laws that would keep cannabis as more of a craft industry, as opposed to really just opening it up and letting, whoever has the best product at the lowest price win. So I think there's things like that that could be done that would create some helpful limits to what the market looks like, that would create more space for social equity work to be done. And I think a corollary of that for me is thinking about kind of the business opportunity and the community reinvestment components, and thinking through what the priorities are there, because I think both of them have their place. But as I have seen social equity develop, the focus has seemed to be primarily on creating those business opportunities. I think it's worth a conversation to see what it might look like to shift some of that priority more towards community benefit, community reinvestment, and how the market could be structured in a way to deliver more on that part of social equity.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a lot to think about as a policy advocate in this space. At least, for the folks who have been involved in California's market, or as an equity applicant or as an advocate and lobbyist for cannabis social equity, we're all too familiar with a lot of the I would say maneuvering we have to do in order to be able to take home some of those benefits from the state, or reap the benefits of the taxes back into our own communities. And while there are some money that's being reinvested into nonprofits, there is little investment going into actual survivors of the war on drugs who wants to get into the cannabis industry. And as was mentioned, $250,000 is a significant amount of money, but it's nearly not enough for anyone to go from getting a conditional use permit or the equivalent of a land use permit to ordering inventory and operating for the next 4 to 6 months. So that number is up at least starting at $1 million, not $250,000, which is a significant barrier to market entry that social equity advocates and operators are still dealing with. So that kind of leads me to my next question. It's been pretty interesting, this year in California state legislator and in California cannabis politics at the state level. California's Department of Cannabis Control has been increasing its enforcement efforts to crack down on unlicensed grow facilities. And are you familiar with this? And if so, do you agree with the framing of these efforts as a drug war 2.0?
Thank you for that. I am not as familiar with what's happening in California as I'd like to be, so I'm excited to learn more. I am familiar with the more general issue, and I referenced this in my presentation, which is that even in a legalized market, there is a need for enforcement. So the regulated marketplace itself has its own justice system needs. And this is, you look at statistics on arrest data, for instance, and you can see this dramatic drop in a place like Colorado, but then you see this kind of stabilization, and you see like, okay, well, why is it that 4,000 people are still getting arrested every year in Colorado for cannabis when cannabis is legal? And it's like, well, you got to look at how the law is written and how that legality is structured, and see that, if you're under 21, it's still basically prohibition unless you've got a medical card. If you want to participate in the industry, but you're not able to get licensed, that's all still illegal as well. And then, I think there's some really difficult issues around some of the unauthorized grows and some of the practices that are being used there. I know there are environmental concerns, there are some human rights concerns. And so from a certain perspective, there is what we might see as a legitimate need for some type of enforcement. However, because of the particular history of cannabis and cannabis prohibition, there's always that specter that we're just regressing to what we had before. And so, for me, it always comes back to, if you want to understand the particular model of legalization that we have, And particularly if you see that as something that's going to be a driver of social change around the criminal justice system in the US, you have to just begin with an appreciation of the fact that the way that legalization has happened maintains a role for the justice system in some capacity, policing, courts primarily. And so I think acknowledging that, and if that feels like it isn't the right way to go about things, then the question from a policy standpoint, I think, is, well, what are the other mechanisms we could use? Because obviously policing, that's kind of like muscle memory. That's like, you know, what we immediately think, oh, this is who deals with these kinds of problems. So I think, you know, are there ways that we could think more about regulators, other types of enforcement that might achieve that same end, if we feel like that's a priority to really shore up the boundaries of the legal authorized market? Are there ways to do that that don't involve traditional law enforcement? So I think for me, that would be kind of the conversation once we acknowledge that maintaining our current system requires some type of enforcement.
Thank you. I guess as a response to that, another question, that'll be our final question you can briefly answer. Would one approach, in your opinion, be to what would the impact of lowering taxes on at least the retail side of the supply chain have on the impact or the influence of the unlicensed market?
Yeah, I mean, I really wish this was kind of like I could buzz Beau in, because I feel like this is kind of right in his wheelhouse. But my sense is that there is a good degree of price sensitivity for a certain number of regular cannabis consumers. For that kind of, you know, once a year on my birthday kind of consumer, like I think they are still going to the licensed dispensary in all likelihood. But I do think that price issues are something that creates a challenge when we are thinking about the ability of the legal licensed marketplace to be successful. And again, I focus more on Colorado than California, but my understanding is California does face some particular challenges in this area for a number of reasons, not just kind of the particular regulatory and tax structure that you all have, but also just your unique history going back to the 90s and experience with legalization and some of that infrastructure that came up. And so I think that, yeah, I mean, I think some type of finding a way for the legal market to be competitive is something that the state legislature is going to have to continue to focus on. And it's not just with that unauthorized market, but it's also with the hemp market that you brought up earlier. And in a lot of ways, that might be the bigger challenge. I can share, you know, I'm in Iowa, so I researched Colorado, a legalization state, but I'm in Iowa, and we have very restrictive laws, and I can still, you know, basically go down the street and buy a THC infused beverage without any problem, thanks to the hemp market. And so that I think is a really significant player in all this. And I'll just stop there.
No, thank you. Because I would ask another question, especially in the hemp context, but we would be here for another maybe 2 to 3 hours discussing all licensed cannabis, social equity, and the encroaching hemp market on the industry and how to deal with it. So, but thank you for your time. Thank you for your presentation today. It was very valuable and informative. Thank you for your time, Will.
Thank you.
And with that, we will move to our next presentation of the night. Dr. Magaly Ordonez. Again, Dr. Magaly Ordonez is a Latinx Sexualities postdoctoral fellow at the University of Utah.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay, thumbs up if you can see and hear.
I sent you thumbs up. Not sure if you can see.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. and to our previous presenters, Beau and Will. Let me hide this little strip. So, buenas tardes, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Magaly Ordonez. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm joining you all today from Utah, the traditional homeland of the Ute, Paiute, Shoshone, Navajo, and many other Native communities who have lived or crossed through Utah. And my title today for my presentation is Cannabis Social Equity. I'll be looking into the aspects of gender, disability, and indigeneity. And I come to this research today from personal experience. I am a medical cannabis patient, and there is history in my family of cannabis cultivation in Mexico. And so that's how I came to this work. And so for my presentation today, I will be beginning with LGBTQ plus histories of cannabis advocacy here in California. I'll discuss a little bit about women in the industry, followed by a discussion on disability and access. I'll talk a bit about Indigenous communities in the cannabis industry, and I will conclude with some next steps that I consider important as we move forward with social equity programs. So the history of cannabis, part of it begins, or where I begin is in the 90s, right? LGBTQ activists such as Dennis Perone, Harvey Milk, Brownie Mary, among many other folks, have paved the way in their advocacy for cannabis, specifically medical cannabis in California. And so this particular genealogy of cannabis advocacy in California is directly tied to LGBTQ plus alternative spaces, such as the cannabis buyers clubs that began in the early 90s. And so on the screen here on the right, you see an image with a purple background titled "The Purpose of the Cannabis Buyers Club." This is from a pamphlet for San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club in the GLBT Historical Society based in San Francisco. And so much of my work is qualitative work, including ethnographic and archival and some digital humanities. So this is part of some archival research that I did earlier this year in California. And it's a good reminder for folks who are interested in cannabis advocacy to remember how we came to have access to a dispensary. And so brief history lesson about how do we even have cannabis dispensaries as we know it today? Well, they began with cannabis buyers clubs that were not-for-profit clubs that were open to all folks who were treated by a physician. And so this was during a time of the AIDS epidemic. So it was a response to the AIDS epidemic. And it began in 1991 in California, began in San Francisco, and then it moved down to Southern California, where I'm originally from. I'm from LA. There was a headquarters in LA as well. But folks were able to bring their physician's record if they were comfortable with it or what they were diagnosed with. So they would come into a cannabis buyers club and they would give a donation. So for folks who might know a little bit about the underground dispensaries, before it was legalized, it was a donation model, right? So you would give what you can. That was the intent, right? But there was a set price for buying a gram, an eighth, et cetera, in these underground dispensaries. But donation models actually began in cannabis buyers clubs in California. So what that meant, it was that folks came in, paid up an annual membership fee. At the time, it was about $20 to $25 to have access to the club, and they would give what they can for the cannabis that they needed to treat their condition or to help with the pharmaceutical effects that came about for taking particular prescriptions to deal with or treat HIV and AIDS during the time, right? And so the cannabis buyers clubs that we see here on the screen were meant to offer a clean, safe environment, a social club atmosphere, and also I think what's very important is the fourth bullet. They offer literature concerning AIDS and cancer information updates. So they offered information and knowledge and research to the folks that were coming in seeking medical cannabis during this time. And this began in the 90s, set the foundation for medical cannabis programs and spaces, which then led to the models we see for recreational cannabis. And this is particularly referencing the physical spaces of dispensaries, how we came about to have cannabis dispensaries. And so cannabis and queerness, or queerness is here is used as a very broad term to reference the LGBTQ plus communities. They intersect in the geopolitical realm as their respective policy changes have paralleled similarly to each other, and specifically in the public opinion in the US, as research has showed in 2017. So what does this mean? So for instance, cannabis was recreationally legalized for the first time in Colorado and Washington in 2013. And marriage equality was legalized in the US in 2015. So about the same, around the same time, the 2-year difference. This is just one example to think about this social relationship and political relationship between these two areas, right? We have cannabis and the LGBTQ community, and how historically political change within these particular communities and movements have come about during the same time or similar timelines. And so I think it's very significant to think about when we think about political advocacy and the overlap between different political groups or issues that folks are advocating for, specifically in California. Let's see. And on the screen, you'll see the top left, a cropped screenshot of an article from 1992 titled Taking Pot Out of the Closet by Dennis Perron. So as you remember, he was one of the main advocates for medical cannabis. And his main reasoning behind it was because his partner was fighting AIDS. And so he realized that this was having a positive effect on his partner, and he began to organize and offer cannabis to folks and created the Cannabis Buyers Clubs. And so this screenshot you see on the screen is from the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives at USC in LA. They have a particular folder there that shows a lot of very interesting and fascinating history on marijuana and AIDS, and a further intersection with the queer community, the gay, lesbian, and trans community. And here I wanna quote Dr. Rob Chalala, who's a queer Arab feminist scholar at Cal State Long Beach, does amazing work. And what he does is that he positions a queer feminist political geographic approach to cannabis research. And some of his research exposes a gendered and racialized hierarchies of labor, such as coercive sexualization within cannabis spaces and economies, right? So as some of the previous presenters have offered, right, there's a lot of these issues are very complex. There's no one-way solution to thinking about how to address some of the hurdles that come about when folks are trying to enter the social equity cannabis spaces. But also, right, there's a lot of harm that has happened within the cannabis community and for marginalized communities as we know it. But also cannabis spaces, as Robert Chalala offers us, these insights are particularly important for women of color and transgender workers of color, mainly because they offer social connections and collective belonging within these cannabis spaces, such as the cannabis dispensaries, whether that be recreational medical in the legal aspect or underground, right? So it can be a little blurry when some of the research is, for instance, interviewing folks may be a little fearful about disclosing that they might work in an underground dispensary. And so reports have found that LGBTQ people and communities are underrepresented within the cannabis industry. And it feels a little contradicting because, as I showed in the previous slide, the queer, trans, LGBTQ broader community is helped galvanize the medical cannabis industry, helped establish the Cannabis Buyers Clubs. But when we see it today, data shows that they're underrepresented in the industry. And so throughout my slides, you'll see bolded and underlined text. And if you hover over it, there's a hyperlink that leads to the source of the data that I'm sharing with you all. Yeah, so this is one aspect of the cannabis industry that often goes a little overlooked, but I like to start with this and remind us of how it is that we got here, how it is that we have access to be able to walk into a cannabis dispensary. And it was many of the folks who were advocating for alternative medicine during the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And also more important to note is that we don't hear so much about this because a lot of these folks are no longer earthside. They're no longer around to tell their stories. It's very few folks who made it through this era and even fewer who might be involved in the cannabis industry. And I can talk a little bit about the numbers or the lack thereof during the Q&A. So we have the queer community, and then when we zone into specifically women in the industry, women, often poor mothers of color, historically have carried the financial burden of family responsibilities because men of color were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And so at the same time, there has also been a 260% increase in drug-related arrests among women over the past 35 years. And this is in 2020 by a study put out by the Prison Policy Initiative. And so as of 2022, women constitute only 23.1% of executives and 22% of ownership in the cannabis industry. As well, for instance, in LA specifically, the LA Department of Cannabis, out of the 105 social equity retail licenses as of 2022, there was only 11 that were issued to, oh, sorry, let me rephrase this. So only 11 out of the licenses that were given in LA were social equity licenses, but also when we look further into that, only 4 of the licenses that were given were women owned. So what does this mean? So 4 out of 105 licenses that were given out by the department were owned by women. So that's a very, very small number. And so why is this important? And it's still relevant today, right? There's a gender disparity in the cannabis industry more broadly, but also within social equity licenses and the programs more broadly. And on the bottom of the screen, you'll see also a screenshot of a feature titled Her Say. And this is from 1979. So this is about over 40 years ago, I believe. And then this is from an archival piece from the Normal collections at UC Berkeley at the Bancroft Library. And they were actually just recently processed and available to the public. And so I was very excited to be one of the first folks to be able to see all this very important historical material. And so towards the bottom of this clip of the article, you'll see that what they're saying, the Women's Concerns Committee of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana, which is Normal, called on the FDA and the NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, to get rid of its, quote, paternalistic policies, which prohibit research on women. And so what does this mean? It means that there is not enough research that specifically focus on women in the industry and the impact that cannabis may have on them or the relationship that they have with cannabis in particular. So there is a lack and not enough research that uses a gendered analysis on the cannabis industry more broadly, on social equity programs, although there is research coming out, right? Like, it's not that there isn't any research on women in the industry or queer folks in the industry. It's just not enough. It's not enough research on the matter. Right, and so this is still an issue today. Mind you, this clipping that I'm showing everyone today, Her Say, is from 1979, and this is still an issue today, 40 years later, even before medical cannabis was available, recreational cannabis was available. And so we can see some of the work that still needs to be done. And additionally, some other issues that come about when we talk about gender in the industry and social equity programs. So like other retail and low-wage workers, women and femmes, folks who have a feminine demeanor, which is why I use the term femmes, encounter sexism and harassment, right? Because we do live in a capitalist society, the extraction of labor is heightened for women and femmes, folks who are marginalized. And so, for instance, trimmers in the industry, women trimmers face gender discrimination and harassment. So what happens is that women are often shunted into the role of trimmers due to stereotypes about women possessing nimble fingers or having a higher dexterity. So women trimmers are underpaid in comparison to men, which is honestly not a surprise because in the gender gap, the labor gender gap and the pay gap is in the US and society, women are paid a lot less than men, especially when you add women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, and Latinx women. There's a lot of research on that if folks are interested. And so in comparison to men, women have been actually subject to egregious forms of sexual harassment, including pay incentives for working topless at cannabis farms. And so, right, so these are very particular examples of the ways that women face gender discrimination and harassment in the cannabis industry more broadly. And so what has been done? So women have been creating mentorship communities, such as Women Employed in Cannabis Community Center. They've also created media content, such as a podcast, Women Leading in Cannabis, that features the stories of particular women and their experiences in the industry and how they've navigated such spaces and such instances of discrimination. As you'll see on the screen, top left, you see 3 different women holding cannabis, harvesting cannabis with a yellow background. And lastly, women have also created collectives that demand to be hired in clusters, mainly out of safety, right? And so, or they've also built cooperative relationships to facilitate transportation, mutual aid. Additionally, women have also created and organized harm reduction workshops designed to foster a more safer environment for trimmers who are not only women, but other folks who might have less power or are the least powerful of the cannabis workers. We can think of immigrant folks, right? Immigrant folks are under attack right now. And although I don't cover this specifically in this talk today, there's a large number of immigrant workers in cannabis farms who face additional barriers to being legally involved in the cannabis industry. One example I can give briefly off topic is undocumented folks who disclose that they have worked in a cannabis farm to immigration authorities. That is valid reason to deny them any sort of legal immigration status. And I'm not an expert in this area, but there are a lot of stories of folks who get their citizenship test denied or are not allowed or charged with additional crimes for even admitting like, yeah, I worked in a legal cannabis farm. But that's another topic. And so these are a few examples of the ways that women in the cannabis industry more broadly face discrimination, but it's still happening even when we have established social equity programs. So what this means that it requires an additional lens, an additional layer, and an additional effort on behalf and on the part of policymakers, lawyers, community members to really listen to what women are asking, to really listen to what the queer LGBTQ community is asking and what they need. And I next want to talk about disability and access. So like I mentioned, sick folks during the AIDS and HIV epidemic advocated for cannabis, medical cannabis, to help with the negative side effects of the medications that they were taking. And so what they did and offered us is they modeled care practices that led to current cannabis dispensaries, right? So they established these clubs and said, we want to care for our community during a time where state and federal governments, mainly the federal government, is denying medical help to this particular community because they are socially stigmatized for being gay, lesbian, queer, trans, etc. And so what happened was they got into action. They created these clubs. They offered knowledge. And as you see on the screen here, the left image titled How to Use Medical Marijuana, right? And so we're talking about social equity, but social equity needs to also include access. And what that means is offering folks access to cannabis in a way that meets their needs, right? And so one way, as previously mentioned, is offering them the basic knowledge of how to consume cannabis, which seems very, in an age of technology, anyone can Google it or look it up. But sometimes you just need to have those on hand and offer it to folks. Be like, you know what, this is how you can consume cannabis. Part of offering a social equity model is offering that knowledge, the knowledge that folks need, making sure that folks have all the resources. And so specifically here to folks with disabilities, right? And so some questions to reflect or think about is a space physically accessible? And so many buildings now have to follow ADA, the ADA law or be compliant, mainly for folks with wheelchairs, which is obviously we need that, but also Do folks with visual or auditory impairments have access to such information? Do they have access to what social equity, applying for a social equity license looks, or what it entails? Is this knowledge available to folks who can't see, who can't hear? Like, how do we make this more accessible to folks? Are there any sensory accommodations for folks who have a disability and want to go to a dispensary? So what does this mean? An example of sensory accommodations. When you go to a dispensary, I'm thinking about a random dispensary in downtown LA. You hear the music, right? There's usually a playlist happening, and depending if it's a holiday like 420 or another event, where there might be, for instance, flashing lights. You would think flashing lights set an ambiance to the space, but what if somebody has epilepsy and flashing lights triggers their epilepsy, but they still need to go get their cannabis for their epilepsy, right? So that space is no longer accessible for someone who has a medical condition, or even if they do not have a medical card, but choose to go to a recreational dispensary to treat their medical condition. There can be a sign at the entrance of the door, at the entrance of the dispensary, before they go through security. There's flashing lights, be advised. The same way that they have them for movies now, right? There's a slight warning, content warning, there's flashing lights that may impact photosensitive folks. That's just one example of how we can make some spaces a little bit more accessible for folks. Additionally, disabled folks or folks with disability in the US face poverty rates twice as high as non-disabled people as of 2022 by research with the Century Foundation. And so what this means is that folks already have limited resources financially, right? And so low-cost medicine for disabled folks, specifically cannabis, would make cannabis more accessible, right? There were some discussions earlier about, well, the prices of cannabis are going down, or it needs to be a little bit more competitive. Yes, but also for some people, the prices that are low cost or that are decreasing over the years might actually benefit folks with disabilities or folks who are low income but still need access to cannabis, or might not have a medical cannabis card, but choose to go to a recreational dispensary, for instance. And so when we talk about social equity, right, I mentioned earlier, offering knowledge to folks. People really want to know, they want to learn about cannabis. And in 2022, there was a workshop titled Cannabis for Wellbeing. And you see a flyer here, a cropped flyer on the screen on the right with a yellow background and an image of Miss Kindness Ramirez for the Abilities Expo. The Abilities Expo is a very large event at the LA Convention Center that happens every year, and it's tailored to folks with varying disabilities. It can be physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, etc., different kinds of disabilities, folks who might need different mobility access, or different things to get around in their day-to-day life. But this was happening at the Abilities Expo, right? And so this particular workshop, Cannabis for Wellbeing, was tailored to the disabled community, right? And so this was one way that this presenter, Ms. Kindness, made cannabis knowledge accessible, but also introduced folks with disabilities to cannabis from a different lens. And again, this was hosted by the Social Impact Center. I highly recommend folks to check them out. They are a nonprofit org who are dedicated to helping folks in the community who have been impacted by the war on drugs. They're a really great resource to have handy. And I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous communities. So approximately 26% of Indigenous communities in the continental US are involved with cannabis or hemp programs. As of 2025, earlier this year, the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association released a map that I don't have here on the screen, but I highly recommend folks to check it out, that shows like where across the continental US Indigenous communities are engaging with cannabis, the cannabis industry. And so one of the main concerns among Native communities, and I'm not speaking for the Native communities, right? Every Native community, Indigenous group has their own needs, beliefs, and practices. But overall, as a generalization here that I'm making is that Native communities are concerned about the environmental impacts of cannabis cultivation and the issue of sovereignty of our nations having to defend their sovereignty in the face of cannabis raids on their reservation lands. And so a little bit of background is Public Law 280, which is a law that gives permission to the US federal government to implement or enact federal policy on reservation land. But what this does is that, and that's a very broad, generalized definition of the law. I'm not an expert in it, but it impacts the ways that the federal law or state law implements cannabis policy on reservation land. And so what this means partially is that this particular law is racially motivated towards tribal communities. And so what this does, and a lot of scholars have challenged this law and critiqued it, not just with regard to cannabis, but just in general, because it threatens tribal sovereignty, right? And so tribal nations are sovereign. They have their own governments, their own practices, their own economies even. And so it threatens their sovereignty because the federal government is saying, well, we're still going to implement our laws on your land, even though you're a sovereign nation. And so there's been a lot over the years, there's been a lot of tension and lawsuits by Native communities. Additionally, these particular laws are inconsistently applied across different jurisdictions with Native communities, which is reasonable because, as I mentioned, Native communities, tribal nations have their own laws, right? They have a different ways about for going about and implementing their policies when it comes to cannabis specifically. One example can be the Round Valley Indian tribe in Northern California, which sued the state of California because they were raided. An elder in the community, her garden was raided by the state, well, actually the federal government, because she was growing cannabis. But she was growing cannabis for a medical condition. And so the tribe is suing because it's infringing upon its sovereignty. And so right now what's happening is there's discussion about, is this a thing about criminal law, regulatory law? And so those are some of the complexities and challenges that come with having Public Law 280, which the state of California implements on reservation land. So not all states implement or are in agreement with Public Law 280, but California does. And I want to highlight a quote by Indigenous scholar Caitlin Reed, who is currently at Cal Poly Humboldt. I highly recommend checking her work out. She writes, cannabis cultivation as a wave of resource extraction continues to maintain and rely on settler colonial processes that, by definition, work to facilitate indigenous dispossession. And so what this means is that indigenous communities continue to be dispossessed in the ways that they choose to engage with cannabis. One example that I gave is law enforcement coming onto the reservation and raiding somebody, an elder's home, because she was growing cannabis, right? And so there are cannabis or indigenous communities who are engaging in the cannabis industry in collaboration with the states. And here I have in mind Washington. Washington is one of a prime example of a positive outcome in the relationships that were built between the indigenous communities who choose to be involved in the legal cannabis industry and with the state of Washington. So that's one model that can benefit other states. And again, I'm not an expert in the Washington. A lot of my work is mainly in California. So that's why I'm giving these examples of, for example, this lawsuit or Native scholars. I think Caitlin is one of the few, if not one of the only indigenous scholars who does research on cannabis. There's this amazing book, Settler Cannabis, that she released a few years ago that really details a lot of the harm that's been inflicted upon the Native community, but also what the Native communities are choosing to do, right? At the end of the day, indigenous communities will implement their choice or develop their own cannabis programs that best benefit their communities. And that might be in contradiction with the state of California's legal cannabis industry, their social equity programs, for example. And again, this is not to say that encompasses all of the indigenous communities. This is to move forward, it needs to be tailored to the very individual indigenous communities and what it is they need, right? Because every community needs different things, but it's a matter of building those collaborations, reaching out to the community and being, okay, This is what we have, and how can we improve it, right? So this is part of that reimagination or thinking beyond. Okay, how do we, as Will mentioned earlier, how do we shift? How do we shift the ways we think about the cannabis industry in ways that stop or stop to reproduce harm for certain communities, like indigenous communities, right? So indigenous communities have very different relationships to the land, to plants, to non-human beings that I think are missing from the ways we think about cannabis programs, social equity programs. Yeah, and so to conclude, I want to share some thoughts about what we can do moving forward. But before I begin, I want to give credit to the image on the right you see on the screen. It's a weed plant with the peace sign in a handcuff and a chain. This is from the International Cannabis Alliance for Reform, 1980 at UC Berkeley Bancroft Library. Again, there's an immense wealth of knowledge, and some of these archival pieces that I have so much. I'm fascinated by how much I'm learning and making those connections between what has been done in the past, what we're doing now, and what needs to be done. And what needs to be done, one way is to increase collaborations and funding for a more comprehensive nationwide cannabis equity assessments to evaluate and continuously improve existing state social equity programs, right? So there's states who have their own social equity programs, such as California, Colorado, as folks have been mentioning, and other states, New York, which is good, right? Because they're tailored to the particular state's need, but also to have a more comprehensive data set and more knowledge about what's happening would be to have like a nationwide assessment, something that folks can use, which I'm sure they're in the works, and there's different nonprofits who have um, released them or began to release some of those. But that's one way. Also, we can offer free business consultations tailored to communities of color, women, LGBTQ plus, and disabled people. And not just through like nonprofits, right? But through the state and the social equity programs, some of the resources and funds can be used towards that, right? To help folks and like assess, offer them knowledge about, okay, what forms do I have to fill out, etc. But offering more of that, more consultations. We can also do DEI training, diversity, equity, and inclusion training as a component within existing social equity programs. And this will better equip business operators to hire and promote women, queer folks, LGBTQ folks, marginalized communities. And while the DEI is under attack right now, we need to be creative about the ways that we word things, about how it is that we are approaching the challenges that come with a lot of the racist rhetoric that's suing and dismantling DEI programs across the state, across the nation, and in the cannabis industry. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, we can develop strategies for immigrant workers in cannabis farming who are vulnerable to exploitation in ways that are similar to agricultural workers, including labor trafficking, wage theft, and psychological stress. And again, this stems from varying intersecting power structures that marginalized communities have to navigate across society and the cannabis industry and the social equity programs. There's a lot of hurdles. And so how do we diminish those hurdles? How do we get rid of those hurdles so that folks are better equipped to navigate the industry and the social equity programs? Businesses can also prioritize sourcing 50% of cannabis or their products from women-owned or minority farms and businesses. And lastly, I've been recently thinking about this is healthcare and insurance could cover cannabis for folks with disabilities, and with the medical cannabis card, for instance, maybe folks can get even more discounts. This feels like a far leap, but I think it's worth considering and thinking about when we're having conversations about how do we shift, how do we change things, how do we make things work better, how do we meet the needs of communities who continue to be oppressed and further marginalized within an already established cannabis industry. How do we make these social equity programs better? I think this last bullet point is a broader conversation about healthcare and insurance in the US, but it's worth teasing out and thinking about like what would it look like for folks to be able to put cannabis on their medical insurance if they choose to have medical cannabis, for instance, which would make it like a little bit more accessible for folks And I think I want to conclude by reminding folks that there's always work to be done, but we can't do it alone. We have to be in communication with the communities who are impacted. We're always learning, right? I learned so much from our previous presenters, and I hope that the knowledge that I have shared with you on the slides and the resources that I share with folks are helpful in your endeavors for making the cannabis industry more equitable, more accessible, and rooted in the communities that have made it possible. So thank you, everyone, and feel free to hit me up if you have any questions, and I make myself available. And thank you again to everyone for showing up.
Thank you. All right, there we go. Thank you, Magaly. We are at the have gone across the 7 o'clock hour, and I had some questions for you. However, I would like to open the floor for questions that have been entered into the Q&A, and there was one that I think fits perfectly with the questions that I had that relate to the indigenous community and their relationship with the cannabis plant. So Patty Harris said, do any of the experts here have any data or done research on tribal cannabis that exists outside of state markets? Her interest is in reference to the social equity and revenue generation in tribal communities where poverty and drug/alcohol use problems exist and may be helped with a business model focused on medical use and cannabis education to assist in reducing addictions of legal substances such as alcohol and RX opioids.
I can give a comment to that briefly. So, like I mentioned, indigenous communities across continental US have different models for engaging with cannabis, right? There's no standard way or model or policy for folks on reservations to follow. But Washington State has a really good model. It's been a very generative relationship that the state has built with Native communities in Washington, and Nevada as well. Nevada has has had positive outcomes from Native communities being involved in the cannabis industry. And again, there's also research coming about, and maybe Beau can talk more about this. Folks are using cannabis to mitigate some of the opioid addictions that people might be struggling with. And again, this needs to be tailored to particular communities. This needs to have the input from Native communities who know best what they need. And I agree that cannabis knowledge needs to be accessible. Like there needs to be more comprehensive histories, the side effects, things that people need to know, even if it's not in a medical dispensary. Like this is knowledge that folks are curious about, that sometimes a Google search can't suffice. And so this is knowledge that should be readily accessible. And I encourage everyone to look at the particular Native communities and what they're doing, because each community has different relationships with the plant and their economies that might not function within a capitalist economy. So yeah.
Thank you. Beau, Will, do you have anything more to contribute on that question?
I don't know. Thank you.
Cool. And I will open it up to at least the floor or to the panelists to answer the next question, and probably do one more before we conclude for the evening. But to the panel, the question from Sandeep Seeth, I am curious if the states have considered furthering cannabis social equity initiatives by modeling the requirements on existing legislation, such as the Community Reinvestment Act, which mandates similar requirements for community banks and requires them to make investments into their communities based on the specific local needs. I can speak to California, and I will let our panelists at least touch on the respective states they've either studied or are settled in. But California, under the Prop 64 framework, obligated tax revenues to go into a community reinvestment grant or community reinvestment fund. And those funds are only eligible for applications through requests for proposals, grant applications, etc., from healthcare serving institutions. I don't focus on that framework of that law or that funding stream. But the other framework I believe goes to community benefit organizations that are settled in parts of cities and counties that have been impacted by the war on drugs based on census data for low income and other state census data or state data in which they attribute low income designation to a community. And I think that revenue is about, or that the funding is 50 million every year, I believe. So upwards to 50 million, between 40 and 50 million every year to CBOs in those communities to focus on reentry services, mental health services, job placement services, and there's three other categories that are just not top of my mind. But that is administered by the Governor's Office of Economic Business and Economic Development. That is the most similar to what the CRA, as you stated, but I'm not sure what other states have done in that regard.
Khalil, I can say I'm not sure what's happening in other states, but I actually spent a lot of time thinking about this. My partner works on racial justice in the banking industry. So we talk about the CRA all the time. And it does raise this interesting question about when thinking about the tax revenues coming in, or, if you've got the for-profit model that we have, throughout, the states that have legalized, or if we're thinking about a state store model where then the government keeps all of that revenue as opposed to it going to private businesses, setting aside some of those funds for loan guarantees or providing capital to individuals who historically have been discriminated against in this particular industry, or just discriminated against in general, but keeping those funds available to not necessarily just be cannabis specific. Right? If someone wants to invest in something else but can't get the capital, potentially, you could potentially use some of those resources there. So I do think as we start thinking about, for places that are designing or redesigning their equity programs, to think potentially broader than just necessarily investing in cannabis, but, potentially keeping some of those, revenues set aside for those that have difficulties accessing capital. Like, so we know about with structural racism and how it affects credit scores. And so I would just encourage folks to think a little bit more broadly there. And so I really appreciate that question.
Cool. This will be our last question for the evening from Christina Fountain, or Fontaine, however you say it, depending on your dialect. Has there been any progress in promoting programs that benefit women and LGBTQ plus communities, in particular in the cannabis industry, and how can the legal community assist in this regard?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. There hasn't been enough done to support women and LGBTQ communities specifically. I think that there's a lot more nonprofit work and community advocates who offer the space and create the spaces for folks to come in and ask their questions. Or, for example, the Social Impact Center does a lot of events with the LGBTQ community and hosts expungement clinics, workshops for folks who want to be involved in the cannabis industry or be a cannabis advocate, but also trauma informed, for instance. They offer those types of workshops for folks that are tailored to folks who in the community who have been marginalized or impacted by state violence, for instance, or harassment, as some of the data is showing, by women of color, trans women. And there's also, I think, a need to create and gather more data about this particular community, because there's not enough. I think as of now, there's not a comprehensive demographic data that's collected from folks in the cannabis industry more broadly. There's snippets or anecdotal evidence, but one way is creating those surveys, creating those data sets, creating that knowledge and gathering that information from community members. Yeah, off the top of my head, the Social Impact Center offers a lot of resources for this particular community, and maybe other folks know of other resources.
Perfect. Thank you. If there is not any more dialogue on that last question, we can conclude for the evening. Cool. Well, thank you all to our panelists. Thank you for spending the time with us tonight and sharing your very well researched and experienced opinions and your research. I'm sorry. It's been a pleasure to listen to you, and I'm sure there's a lot for folks to take in. And we likely will revisit this recorded webinar to make sure we absorb all of the information that has been presented tonight. So thank you for your time.